Origins First Builders. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens according to this game. This is a game set in ancient times where the aliens did come here to give us the technology and all the good stuff that we use to build the pyramids and iPhones and ancient laser guns or whatever it is. So in this game, we're gonna place our workers next to motherships, and that's what's gonna allow us to build the stuff that in other games you build in ancient civilizations, but also not, because it won't take you long to realize that this game basically has no theme. It is a worker placement game with, again, some art, but the theme is either scattered all over the place or is not there, which is ultimately almost the same. The general idea is pretty good. The general idea to me is pretty interesting and exciting, which is a worker placement game where the workers are represented by dice, and they will be mainly placed in these areas, again, next to the motherships of the aliens that are coming to bring us science and processed food. So, when we're placing one of our workers next to a spot, several things will happen. At the very least, we will always be able to take one of the two actions indicated there. If the value of the die that we place is equal to or higher than the value indicated on the corresponding mothership. After we place a die there, then we turn it so that the value increases. If you're placing a die with a value which is lower than the present value, then you had to pay wisdom or you had to pay gold, which is a wild resource, to pay for the difference. So the idea of a worker placement where things become more expensive as you go until a point where, of course, they don't. That's pretty cool. Incidentally, the idea of this variable cost for action for worker placement, it reminds me of the game Gugong, which I played several years ago and I really liked. So this is the core mechanic. This is the core mechanic. Place a die there, activate at least one of the actions indicated there in those spaces with the blank background. If you place a 6, then you get to activate both of those actions, plus if your die matches the color of the tile that you see there, then you also get to take the bonus action indicated here. Now, these tiles are not printed on the board. The idea is that you shuffle them, you place them randomly, so in one game, this bonus will be associated with those things, that bonus with that thing. We found that that's not that big of a deal. Actually, sometimes it can make some actions really powerful, and I think maybe it would have been a good idea to just, make sure that all the combinations are balanced and just print those on the board, but that's just my assessment. But again, that is the general idea of this worker placement here. Place dice there, and that's it. Then, during the game, for example, using that action, you'll be able to also gain these blank dice that are called speakers, as opposed to these guys are called freemen. And a speaker, well, has no colors, so we'll never be able to trigger one of the bonuses, but you can still send the speaker there and take, again, one of the actions indicated there. You also have an Archon, also known as the miniature. An Archon counts at the beginning of the game as a colorless die of infinite power. So you can always place the Archon next to one of the ships and get the action, one of the actions, regardless of the value there. During the game, you may also be able to associate multiple colors, not just one, but multiple colors with the Archon, but they start as colorless. So it's a worker placement. We start by placing some workers and resolving the corresponding actions indicated there. To give you a sense, some of these actions you probably know and or imagine. Of course, we're gonna collect resources. So there's gonna be actions to collect 3 food, 3 wisdom, 3 rocks. Interesting enough, when it comes to the counter mix, there's no 3 denomination. And that was kind of silly, I think, when so many things are in 3, it'd be very convenient. Also, food and gold, not nearly different enough from one another, in my humble opinion. Something similar with some of these dice. looking right now through the lens of the camera, they look more different than they look in real life and maybe late at night. I just think that there's a couple of things in the production that could have been done, I think, a little more effectively. Including, I should mention this, what you see here, the motherships, I colored in these black pips using a marker. That's it. Because otherwise it's one piece of plastic. And then I set up the game the first time when I was learning the rules. I didn't even notice that there were dice printed them. So let alone seeing those pips sitting across the table. So a couple of things in the production are really a little bit, they feel rushed to me. So one action that you will take, of course, is to collect resources, and that makes sense, I would say. Then we have advancing on the temple tracks, which you have 3 temples, but also not, because they are exactly identical. They each have a special card, so when you advance on that track by spending actions, you will collect the card. And if somebody else advances on the track, even if they are below you, they take the card. At the end of the round, it'll go back to the player who has the most, but during the round, these cards may change. And they have different abilities and bonuses, but are incredibly situational. Like this one says, every time you close a district, and many have that trigger. That doesn't happen very often. That you're not gonna close a district every other turn, at least in our experience. I don't know how you could possibly do that, considering how many resources and actions you have to spend. So, the tracks, very abstract, and they give you points, mind you, don't mind that. But for the, there's no flavor in them, and and those actions are not super important. Something that is super important is the military track. So each player is gonna have a token there, and by spending actions that allow you can spend actions that allow you to move on this track, and that's good. When you pass one of those thresholds with that marker, you take a superiority token, and that will allow you, by spending it, to take 2 actions in a row, which can be super mean if you're just gonna take actions that remove some limited resources. Also, you can, when you're there, you can spend actions to actually trigger military conflict, not just to advance. When you trigger military conflict, then you score a victory point for each of these symbols that are behind you, and also for each marker of the opponent that are behind you. So there are 2 people. I play with other 2 players, their markers are here, I trigger the military conflict, I score 4 points, 2 for those markers there, 2 for that. I also get to collect the resource next to that. This is a very powerful element of the board, in a certain sense, again, and specifically because of the ability to take in 2 actions in a row in some really important moments of the game. Another action is to build your city. You will use these tiles here, and to build you need to spend the wisdom associated with the space next to it, plus the stones indicated on the tile themselves. Suppose that I really want to build this one here, then right now that would cost me 2 wisdom and 3 stones. I spend that, and I get to place this in my city, and we'll see what that does. And then we slide all of the tokens that are under the space that were just freed, and we take a token of the same color as the one I just took, and we place it there at the bottom. So basically, some of these can be very cheap. So that one, for example, only cost me 2 stones, and I take it. Everything else becomes cheap, but it means that the next of the same type is gonna go at the bottom and be pretty expensive. Now, every player starts with a city that looks like this. There you go, with an agora and a palace. And yes, there are tokens on it, aren't they? We'll see what those do. And when you get a new tile, you place it orthogonally adjacent to at least one of your previous spaces. When you have 4 that close like this and they leave that space there, that has not been left there by chance, because they allow you to close the district. That means before the game starts, you draw a number of cards that show that kind of pattern there. If you formed a district that follows that pattern, say for example I have 3 purple districts like that, or 2 and a purple one, 2 yellow and a purple one, and you can rotate them, you can mirror them, it's all good because it's already hard enough as is. So if you match that, you can close the district by placing a die there. And suppose that I decide to place a die there because that matches. It doesn't, but just, you know, with the power of imagination, imagine it does. When you close a district, you place a die there. Also, when you're adding tiles to a city, you get to trigger the power indicated there, which can be super powerful or super not. And when you close a district, you also get to trigger all the powers of the tiles in the district of the same color as the die that you are using. So, that's for closing districts. You can also spend action spending gold to increase the height of the towers that are there. The cost in gold is 1 gold per floor of the tower that is already there. I want to increase that one, it's a 1, I spend a gold. I want to increase it more, now I spend 2 golds to place a 3rd floor there, and so on and so forth. These are important because at the end of the game, each die that you placed in your closed districts will be worth a number of points equal to the pips there, multiplied by the number of floors in the corresponding tower. So right now it would be 4 times 1. It was a bad idea to increase orange, I guess. This player 8 here, each player has 1, and this indicates our resources. Each player will start with a number and a combination of dice, meaning a combination of different values and colors. Each player starts with 2 trays and with an archon. Remember this person here? Now, with an archon. The dice that you actually send to the board, they need to be on this base here. You start with 2, then later you can spend food to free up more. With 2 food tokens, you get that one, and then 4, and so on and so forth. And if you free them all, if you free all of your trays, then you score 10 points. And so that means that even if I take the action, which is on the board, of collecting a new die, from a supply, and I also need to spend wisdom on top of the action, I need to have a tray to place it, otherwise the action does not do anything. Now, so we'll place these dice there, remember, taking actions and stuff. At the end, and so we resolve all of the actions that you have seen, basically triggering actions when you visit the motherships, closing district, building tower levels, freeing up trays. Once everybody's done, because they use all of their dice, including possibly the speakers, the dice go back home, but when they do so, they're increased by 1 pip. They become more expert. Something also happens at this point, because of course, if it's a 4 or a 5, maybe that's the good time to use 1 die to close a district, because that will give me more points at the end of the game. However, if a die gets to 6, I don't get to place it to... I cannot place it to close a district anymore. It goes here in this section of my player aid. It becomes an advisor. And that means, and that now is a color that my Archon has. Incidentally, you can only have 1 per color, so if I took another orange, it would score me some points, but I could not add a 6 orange here. It would need to be discarded. Incidentally, filling up this section here with 1 die per color is one of the triggers for the end of the game. And again, these don't do much other than, however, giving colors to the Archon, who then will be able to trigger those color bonuses up there. Other triggers are a number of tokens indicating levels of the towers have been taken. I'm not setting up the game because it's quite a chore, but there would be a number of these tokens there. When the dice of a certain color are exhausted, you would need to add more to the offer of the dice. That's also another trigger. So different things may happen. Another point, you will score points from a variety of sources. You should have already scored points, a lot of those during the game, from special effects that may come from the building tiles, from other things that you do, and then you're gonna have points for the temples, points from the board. You collect points from all possible sources, and the player with the highest score wins the game. Origins first builders. There is a core idea in this game which I like very much. It's sort of like the non-binary worker placement. In so many worker placements, it's a binary situation, either or, on, off, 1 or 0. I place somebody in a space and that's it. Other people cannot place that, including myself. Other peoples cannot be there. Either or. I like the idea of the non-binary worker placement, meaning that the restrictions that you get as you play is the increased cost in some things. Again, Gugon did that. I love that. I love the general idea. I love the core idea of the changing values, even to the point that they don't always go up, but you may force and manipulate things in such a way that after the 6, there's a 1, and everybody rushes there. I think it's a great idea. I think there could be a fantastic game built around it, but this ain't it. First, there are all these little problems with the production that I showed you that I would expect a professional production by 2022 with the standards of the hobby. They should have cut all of those ideas. And of course, that makes it a little bit suspicious. There's a certain rushed feel to the production, and probably that also reflected maybe there was some rushed approach when it came to the mechanics, because the design has so many different things. They go in many different directions and don't really come together, don't mash all the way, they don't congeal in a nice organic experience of play. And one of the biggest problems that I have here with the design is that, well, I like games that give me a lot of interesting decisions, meaningful decisions. That's the beauty, the dilemma, the excitement, the engagement of playing a game. There are all these things that I could do, and they are more or less equally cool. Now, here there are a lot of things that you can do. The list is long, but at any given time, there tends to be some actions that are almost on autopilot. There just are actions that at specific times in the game are much more preferable. And so although technically the menu of actions is there the entire time, de facto that narrows the number of interesting options that you're going to consider. If you start spending gold early on to build your towers that only matter at the very end of the game when you're multiplying things, that's not going to work. So you can ignore that action for most of the game. The last turn or two, you save some gold, you dump it there on the specific towers that you want to, the match with closed districts where you have good numbers. Closing districts, a mistake that I made was to start closing them too early because it looked so cool as other players were hoarding dice. And guess what? I was last by a long stretch. So the tableau building, build an area with those awesome effects, it could be great, but it doesn't pay off until much later in the game. Getting extra dice, those speakers, those extra dice, of course, it's a tight dice economy. If I can find a way of getting 2 extra dice every turn and my opponent's dope, that's a dominant strategy. There's no intrinsic negative there. And so the first player will want to do that. They spend a superiority token. Right there, they start the turn with 2 extra dice. Which you say, okay, that's a reward for something that they did. They plan to have that token. But there's another weird aspect that gives an advantage to the person sitting next to them in player order. That person didn't spend those resources to be second, but they still get a chance, if they also have a token, of getting extra dice. So it seems almost every turn started with people grabbing all of those extra dice as fast as possible, and then later you do other things, which just causes disproportion in that element. I wish probably I'd like to try the game without those extra dice, that everybody just has what you get through the main actions, because that can really make the game pull toward one player rather than other players. And so you just have this great range of actions, but ultimately it seemed to me that it boiled down to hoarding dice and bases as fast as you can, and then later on start using them. Other thing that again caused that disproportion to me is that some of those game effects are not particularly cool, are not particularly interesting. The facts that are based on every time you close a district, that's not going to happen very often. You're not going to close 15 districts, and so that really pays off. And I close a district and somebody steals a card from me, and then I cannot use it in that specific time. We didn't see those effects that come from the temples as being particularly relevant. You can't fully invest on them because, again, throughout the turn, people can take them from you. And that's kind of weird that those effects that had to do with long-term actions and they can be moved around so easily that we didn't feel like particularly engaged in that strategy. And that leaves you with 3 temples that are 3 numerical tracks for victory points. And sure, you're trying to get them all 3 up because at the end you'll only score the lowest 2, but you're bringing up tokens on 3 completely bland numerical tracks. So you have that element. It's a lot of a complicated range of actions that boils down to a lot of hoarding and a couple of other things. To me, the game really felt that the game was around the Meitei track. Of all the applications, that seems to be the one that paid off the most because also gave you superiority tokens, allowing you to get more dice. And then sure, you build stuff. But that seemed to be a major dominant strategy early on. Later, you switch onto more of city building. So it felt pretty railroaded in terms of strategy, which of course reduces the fun. And if I had it's a little railroaded, all those things, but I'm playing for 40 minutes, well, I guess, sure. But it's a long game. It says here 60 to 120 minutes. It can easily go to 3 hours. Easy peasy. I've experienced that. So it just lasts too long for what it has to offer, which is a fairly limited range of options at any given time of the experience. When you put all these things together, to me, this is a fairly weak offer in the genre worker placement, especially when it comes to what are the standards now. 2005, this would have been mind-blowing, crazy, awesome, amazing. But now we have worker placements that give you a more compelling range of options with the more efficient production, and they play in an hour or 2, and so that this is just not competitive. So Origins First Builders, I find it to be a fairly weak or quite weak entry in the worker placement genre, and one that I personally don't find it competitive given the other options. I just don't see a reason to get this game on the table when we feel like playing a worker placement game where there are just so many games that do much more with less of a headache, quicker setup, and they last less.